It was the day of the most lavish wedding in New York, when everything shattered at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Robert Sterling, America's most powerful steel magnate, was about to watch his daughter Julia marry Count Alessandro Medici, uniting two of the wealthiest families in a $50 million wedding. 300 guests, international journalists, even European royal family members were present. But when little Matthew, Robert's 8-year-old son, stood up during the ceremony and asked to speak, no one imagined what he was about to say. His words, spoken clearly in front of the altar, decorated with $100,000 orchids, revealed a truth so shocking that Robert went pale instantly. In seconds, what should have been the most beautiful day of Julia's life became the biggest scandal in American high society. And Robert Sterling, the man who had never backed down from anything, did something no one expected. St. Patrick's Cathedral had never hosted such a lavish wedding in its storied history. Robert Sterling had transformed the Gothic cathedral into a fairy tale palace with white orchids imported from Thailand, solid silver candelabras, and a pure silk carpet that cost more than most people's homes. $300,000 for flowers alone, $2 million for catering, $10 million for the reception that would follow at the family estate in the Hamptons. Robert Sterling, 55, had built his steel empire from the ashes of his father's failed factory. Sterling Steel was now the third-largest steel company in America, with revenues exceeding $3 billion annually. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted was to see his daughter Julia marry Alessandro Medici, an Italian count of ancient Tuscan nobility. The wedding represented the strategic merger of two empires, Sterling's new money and the Medici family's aristocratic prestige. Alessandro brought a surname dating back to the Renaissance. Robert brought the billions necessary to restore the historical palaces of the noble family. Julia, 24, had grown up knowing she would one day marry someone chosen by her father to consolidate family power. Beautiful, intelligent, Harvard MBA graduate, she had accepted the engagement to Alessandro more out of duty than love. The Count was attractive, educated, perfect on paper, but between them lacked that spark that makes hearts race. In the front row, dressed in a custom-made little tuxedo, sat Matthew, Robert's 8-year-old son. The boy was born from the magnate's second marriage to Francesca, a model 20 years younger who had died in a skiing accident when Matthew was only 3. Since then, the little boy had grown up primarily with nannies, while Robert focused on his business and Julia's career. Matthew was a precocious child, with his father's dark, penetrating eyes and a sensitivity that no one in the family had ever truly understood. He spent hours observing adults, listening to conversations they thought were private, absorbing information that a child his age shouldn't have known. The ceremony began with the solemnity typical of high society weddings. Father Michael O'Brien, Archbishop of New York and Robert's personal friend, officiated the rite with the gravity required by the occasion. The guests were a who's who of America's elite: industrialists, politicians, aristocrats, even some members of European royal families. Julia entered the cathedral on her father's arm, stunning in a French lace gown that cost $200,000. The dress was a masterpiece of craftsmanship that had required 6 months of work. Robert looked at her with pride, seeing not only his beloved daughter, but also the culmination of all his dreams of social ascension. Alessandro waited at the altar, impeccable in his mourning coat, wearing his family's noble decorations on his chest. He was the perfect image of an Italian count, elegant, refined, with that aristocratic nonchalance that only centuries of lineage can confer. The first minutes of the ceremony proceeded without incident. Father O'Brien spoke about the importance of Christian marriage, the union of two souls before God, the responsibility of founding a family. The guests listened in religious silence, many already thinking about the reception that would follow. It was during the reading of sacred scripture that Matthew stood up, At first, no one paid attention. It was normal for a child to move during a long ceremony, but when Matthew began walking toward the altar, murmurs of curiosity crossed the cathedral. Robert signaled for him to return to his seat, but Matthew continued walking with that determination only children have when they've decided to do something. He arrived in front of the altar and turned toward the assembly, his small face serious like an adult's. "Excuse me, I need to say something important." The silence that fell was absolute. Father O'Brien looked at him perplexed. Julia went pale. Alessandro seemed confused. Robert jumped up, ready to retrieve his son and apologize for the interruption. But the words Matthew spoke stopped everyone in their tracks. "My sister can't marry Count Alessandro because he's already married. I saw the documents in Daddy's study. He has a wife in America and 2 children." The silence that followed was like the void before an earthquake. Then the greatest chaos New York had ever seen exploded. The chaos that erupted in St. Patrick's Cathedral was something never seen before. 300 guests rose simultaneously. A roar of incredulous voices filled the ancient church. Photographers' flashes began blazing like crazed lightning. In seconds, the year's most elegant ceremony transformed into the biggest scandal in American high society. Robert Sterling remained motionless for a few moments, as if his brain couldn't process what he had just heard. Then his face became ice, the same ice that had terrorized business competitors for 30 years. He moved toward the altar with steps that resonated on the marble like hammer blows. Alessandro Medici had turned pale as his silk shirt. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the child who had just destroyed his life with a few innocent words. He tried to maintain aristocratic composure, but his eyes betrayed absolute panic. Robert turned to one of his assistants, always present even at private ceremonies. "Marco, call the private investigator immediately. I want everything on Alessandro Medici within an hour. Everything." The assistant pulled out his phone, while the Count understood his cover was about to be blown away. The Sterling family hadn't gotten where they were by trusting people's word. Robert always verified everything, but this time he had been blinded by the prestige of the Medici name. Father O'Brien tried to restore order, suggesting they momentarily suspend the ceremony and clarify the situation privately. But Robert had other intentions. "No," he said with a voice that froze everyone's blood. "I want everyone to hear. If this man lied to my family, if he dared play with the Sterling honor, all of New York will know." Meanwhile, Matthew remained at the center of attention with the calm of someone who had done what needed to be done. He approached his sister and took her hand. When Julia asked how he knew all this, the child explained with disarming simplicity that he had seen documents on his father's desk and photos of an American family where the father looked exactly like Alessandro. The assistant's phone rang. Marco answered, spoke for a few minutes, then approached Robert with a shocked face. The confirmation came like a stab. Alessandro Medici had been married since 2018 to Jennifer Walsh, an American citizen with twin children aged 6. The marriage was celebrated in Las Vegas and was still valid. The silence that fell in the cathedral was deafening. Even journalists stopped taking photos, understanding the gravity of the situation. Alessandro wasn't just a liar. He was a bigamist about to commit a crime in front of 300 witnesses. Robert turned to Alessandro with a look that would have made even a lion tremble. The truth that emerged was even more sordid. The Medici family had been in financial ruin for years, all assets mortgaged. The Count about to declare bankruptcy. The marriage to Julia was the last desperate attempt to save a centuries-old patrimony from complete ruin. Alessandro, cornered, attempted a desperate defense, but it was useless now. He confessed he needed the Sterling money to save the family patrimony, that he thought he could fix the American situation after the marriage. Robert took Julia and Matthew by the hand. "The ceremony is over," he announced, with a voice that resonated throughout the cathedral. Count Alessandro Medici is a fraud and a liar. The Sterlings don't associate with dishonest people. He addressed the crowd of guests, announcing the reception was cancelled, and that anyone who had collaborated in this lie would do well not to show their face again. As the Sterling family headed toward the exit, Alessandro fell to his knees in front of the altar, realizing he hadn't just lost an advantageous marriage. He had lost his reputation, his social position, and probably his freedom. Matthew, walking between his father and sister, looked up at Robert. "Dad, did I do the right thing telling the truth?" Robert stopped, looked at his 8-year-old son who had saved the family honor, and for the first time in years smiled genuinely. "Yes, Matthew, you did perfectly right. You're a true Sterling." In the hours following the failed wedding, the Sterling estate in the Hamptons transformed into a besieged fortress. Journalists from across America had rushed to cover what the media had already dubbed the wedding of the century that failed. Robert had tripled security, but couldn't prevent news helicopters from surveying the property. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was surreal. The staff who were supposed to serve at the reception wandered around not knowing what to do. Mountains of Dom Perignon champagne, beluga caviar, Guillardot oysters, all destined for a party that would never happen. Robert had locked himself in his study with his most trusted lawyers. Documents on the table confirmed every detail of Alessandro's double life. Married in America since 2018, debts exceeding $20 million, all family assets mortgaged, bankruptcy imminent. The marriage to Julia was the last desperate attempt to save a centuries-old patrimony. Upstairs, Julia had taken refuge in her childhood room, still wearing the $200,000 wedding dress. Matthew consoled her with childhood's innocent wisdom, explaining it was better to know the truth before rather than after. When she asked how he had understood the deception, Matthew confessed a truth that surprised his sister. Alessandro never looked at her the way their dad used to look at their mom. When Robert spoke about their deceased mother, his eyes sparkled, while Alessandro looked at Julia like Dad looked at business contracts. That evening, Robert gathered the family in the main living room. He was tired but determined. He told them Alessandro would be prosecuted criminally, that creditors had seized Medici assets, that the noble title was worthless without money. But the most important thing was they had avoided disaster thanks to Matthew. Robert looked at his son with eyes that truly saw the child for the first time. He confessed to having built the empire and planned Julia's future, but never paying attention to the son right in front of him. From that day, everything would change. No more arranged marriages, no more strategic alliances. Julia could only marry someone she loved, and Matthew would come to the office with him to learn what it meant to be a true Sterling. Honor and truth, not just money and power. That night, the family dined together for the first time in years, in the kitchen, with the simplicity of a real family. Robert realized an 8-year-old child had taught him the most important lesson. All the money in the world is worthless if you lose honor. 3 months after the failed wedding, the Sterling's life had taken a completely different direction. Robert had kept his promise.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Matthew went to the office with him every day after school, sat in board meetings, observed, and learned how to manage an industrial empire. The child proved to be an exceptional observer. During a meeting with a potential business partner, Matthew noticed the man was lying about his finances. He whispered to Robert that the man always touched his nose when stating numbers, just like Alessandro did when talking about his family. Robert had the partner's accounts verified and discovered Matthew was right. The company was in serious financial difficulty trying to hide it. The deal was canceled, avoiding a $50 million loss. The story of the child who exposed liars began circulating in New York business circles. Competitors called Matthew the Sterling's little detective, but Robert was simply proud of his son. Meanwhile, Julia had begun living her life for the first time. Free from the weight of a strategic marriage, she had resumed traveling, taking art courses, meeting new people. She had also started working at the family charitable foundation, discovering a natural talent for helping the less fortunate. During a charity dinner, Julia met Dr. Marcus Johnson, a Doctors Without Borders physician just returned from a mission in Africa. Marcus didn't know who she was, didn't recognize the sterling name, and this fascinated her immediately. He was the opposite of Alessandro in everything: sincere, passionate, with real values. When Julia told Robert about meeting Marcus, she expected the usual paternal inquisition about family background, financial situation, career prospects. Instead, Robert asked only one question: "Does he make you smile?" The affirmative answer led to a dinner invitation. Marcus proved intelligent, passionate, sincere. He talked about his African experiences with the simplicity of someone who had seen real life. Matthew bombarded him with questions about countries he had visited, diseases he had treated. At dinner's end, Matthew made his final observation: "Doctor, you have the right eyes. When you look at Julia, you have the same eyes Dad had when he looked at Mom." Robert laughed, realizing his son had hit the mark again. Marcus looked at Julia with real love, not calculation or interest. In the following months, Robert observed the growing relationship between his daughter and the doctor. Marcus often came to dinner, always bringing Matthew a gift, never expensive, but always thoughtful. Books about countries he had visited, small African handicrafts, photographs of places where he had worked. When Marcus asked for Julia's hand, Robert tested him with direct questions. The young doctor honestly confessed he had no money, no promising business future, wanted to continue humanitarian work. He didn't want to join Robert's company. Robert smiled. "Perfect. You have permission to marry my daughter. A man who doesn't want my money is exactly what I was looking for, Julia." The wedding was celebrated 6 months later, in an intimate ceremony at the Hamptons estate. Only 40 guests, no journalists, no excessive luxury. Matthew served as best man, proud to have helped his sister find true love. During the reception, Robert took Matthew aside. "Are you happy with the new brother-in-law?" The child responded with his usual wisdom. "Yes, Dad. Marcus has the right eyes, and Julia always laughs when she's with him." Robert embraced his son, realizing this 8-year-old child had changed the entire family's life. He had taught him that honor is worth more than money, that truth is more important than prestige, and that true love is recognized by the eyes of those who look. That night, watching his daughter dance happily with her husband, Robert realized he had won the most important battle of his life, not against business competitors, but for his family's happiness. 2 years after the interrupted wedding, Matthew Sterling's story had become legend in American high society. The child who had exposed a fraudster in front of 300 guests had grown, but hadn't lost his extraordinary ability to read people. At 10 years old, Matthew attended New York's most prestigious school, but spent afternoons at Sterling Steel offices, observing and learning. Robert understood his son had a natural talent for business, not for numbers or strategies, but for the human element that often decided an operation's success or failure. The child had transformed the lesson learned that day in the Cathedral into a life philosophy. At school, he had become the natural mediator in conflicts between classmates, because he could always tell who was lying and who was telling the truth. His teachers were amazed by the child's maturity, but also worried he was growing up too fast. Julia had become a mother. Little Robert, named after his grandfather, was 6 months old, and the family's joy. Marcus continued his humanitarian medical work, but now alternated overseas missions with periods in New York to be with family. Robert observed his family gathered in the mansion's living room and realized how much his life had changed. Before the failed wedding, the house was a luxury museum where only business and social prestige were discussed. Now it was full of laughter, games, real affection. The biggest transformation had occurred in himself. Robert had always believed success was measured in revenue and power. Matthew had taught him that true success is measured in honor, truth, and the ability to protect those you love. This new philosophy had also changed the way of doing business. Sterling steel had become famous for its transparency, crystal-clear contracts, honesty in negotiations. Robert told his managers to do business as if his 10-year-old son were watching. If you can't explain what you're doing to a child, you probably shouldn't do it. Success didn't diminish, it increased. Business partners appreciated Sterling's clarity. Employees worked with more motivation. Competitors respected a company that had made honesty its strength. One evening, while dining together, Matthew made an announcement that surprised the family. He had decided what he wanted to do when he grew up: become a lawyer, but not for money. He wanted to help families who are deceived like they had almost been. Robert felt deep emotion fill his chest. His son wanted to use his talent to protect others from what they had risked suffering. Matthew continued with adult seriousness. When he grew up, he wanted everyone to know that Sterlings always tell the truth, even when it costs dearly. That evening, Robert went to say goodnight to Matthew in his room. The child was reading a law book taken from Robert's library. Robert explained that when he grew up, he would inherit everything he had built. But the most important thing he was leaving him wasn't money or factories, but the sterling reputation. A family that always tells the truth, always keeps its word, always protects the weakest. Matthew hugged his father, promising never to ruin that legacy. That night, Robert stayed awake thinking about the future. He had built an industrial empire, but his true masterpiece was the child sleeping in the next room. A child who at 8 had the courage to tell the truth in front of 300 adults, and now at 10 dreamed of dedicating his life to protecting others from lies. The Sterling dynasty would continue, but not as Robert had planned. It would continue better, guided by a man who had learned from childhood that honor is worth more than any wealth. 10 years after the wedding that never was, New York celebrated Matthew Sterling's 20th birthday with an event that would remain in American high society annals. Not a lavish party like the family once organized, but his graduation summa cum laude from Columbia Law School, followed by an announcement that shocked everyone. Matthew had kept all the promises made as a child. He had graduated with top honors with a thesis on legal protection for families victimized by matrimonial fraud, interned at Europe's best law firms, and was now ready to enter the business world. But not as everyone expected. During the celebration dinner at the Hamptons estate, Matthew announced he would open his law practice specializing in protecting families from matrimonial scams and romantic fraud. It would be pro bono for those who couldn't afford it. He also revealed he had identified a building in Manhattan to transform into the firm's headquarters, a historic palazzo that belonged to the Medici family. Alessandro had lost everything. Creditors had taken all family assets. He now worked as an insurance company clerk and lived in a rental apartment. The palazzo that had been family property for 4 centuries now belonged to a bank wanting to sell it. Matthew wanted to buy it and transform it into a center of excellence for families' legal protection. Not revenge, he explained, but transformation. He wanted a place that represented lies and deception to become a symbol of truth and justice. The project involved a foundation supported by America's wealthiest families. Every family that had ever risked being victim of a matrimonial scam would contribute to the project. Not charity, but investment in everyone's protection. The idea was brilliant. In the following weeks, Matthew presented the project to the country's most influential families. The response was extraordinary. Everyone wanted to participate. The story of the child who had exposed the fraudulent count had become legendary. In 6 months, the foundation raised $30 million. The Medici Palazzo was purchased and transformed into the Sterling Center for Family Protection. Matthew opened his law office on the noble floor, while other floors housed private investigators, specialized psychologists, financial consultants. On Inauguration Day, a surprise awaited everyone. Alessandro Medici appeared at the ceremony, aged and marked by life, but with the dignity of someone who had learned his lesson. He approached Matthew, thanking him. 10 years earlier, he had stopped him before committing the worst mistake of his life. He had saved him from himself. Alessandro told how he now worked honestly, paid his debts, had reconnected with his children in America. He wasn't rich, but slept peacefully. He apologized to Robert for what he had done to the family, admitting Matthew had taught him that honor is worth more than any wealth. Robert shook his hand, saying the past was past. What mattered was what they did today. That evening, during the inauguration party, Robert took Matthew aside. He confessed that 30 years earlier he had started building an industrial empire, thinking that would be his legacy to the world. But he was wrong. His true legacy was him, a man who at 8 had the courage to tell the truth, and now at 20 had the wisdom to transform others' pain into protection for all. Matthew embraced his father, thanking him for teaching him that being rich means having the responsibility to help others. Robert replied that he had taught him that being honest means being truly free. That night, watching New York shine from the windows of the palazzo that once belonged to the Medicis, Robert realized he had witnessed the most beautiful miracle of his life. An 8-year-old child had saved the family honor with a few brave words, and now that 20-year-old man was transforming that lesson into protection for thousands of other families. The Sterling dynasty would continue, but not only through steel and money. It would continue through truth, honor, and protection of the weakest. And it all began with a child who had the courage to stand up in a cathedral and say, "I need to say something important." Sometimes the simplest words change the world forever. Give a like if you believe telling the truth requires more courage than lying. Comment which moment of the story moved you most. Share to inspire those who believe honor is worth more than money. Subscribe for more stories of families who choose truth. Sometimes one brave child is enough to save an entire family's honor. Sometimes truth hurts more than lies, but it heals forever. And sometimes the most important lessons come from the smallest and most innocent voices. Because honor isn't inherited, it's earned through your choices.